you're absolutely welcome to. Um, that tends to be what people who don't really have an argument do. I think it's kind of that like attack first so that nobody, can challenge you, right? If you attack first, then people are less likely to tell you or have points or to be able to share points. It's kind of like that hit first, ask questions later mentality, and I get it. Like, I mean, I get it somewhat. But I don't think that it's beneficial to you, and I would say that you probably aren't getting much of an education. Um, so we are over on TikTok or on YouTube as well. Sorry, I'm a little late coming in. I'm going to try something new in here actually today. I'm going to, nope, it's not going to work like that. I think we're going to go with this and then with this. We're going to see if that actually does something for us. I wanted to talk about these subjects. These are subjects we've talked about before. I wanted to address them again and talk about some of them again and see what it is that's actually affecting this, what it is that we need to look at to try and make changes in these areas, and what it is that we need to do to try and create a better space. So we're going to talk a little bit today about, the things that the U.S. is number one in, and what Western thought not only teaches but causes, and how that mentality of control has more of a tendency to be problematic than having a mentality of mutual or a mentality of intertwining, right? A mentality in which you can't control things around you. You're actually controlling yourself, right? And that's pretty much it. So when we're looking at these things, it's really important to note, and a lot of people fail to understand that what we're taught in the US, and we're going to go with the US here, but what we're taught within this space is not necessarily the reality of what is out there. Like what we're taught within this space is not necessarily the reality of the world around us. Not only the world within this space, but the world outside of this space. Oftentimes, what we're taught within this space and within the US is a fantasy that's kind of made up. And that fantasy is that we're the best and we're the greatest, and we're number one in everything. And everybody wants to be us. And this is the best country on earth. That we're the only ones that have freedoms, that racism no longer exists, and that everything is peachy keen and pretty, right? And oftentimes that's what we are like indoctrinated into from a very young age of schooling, from a very young age, just across the board. And I think that as we are looking at that, what we're seeing is this lack of understanding outside of self. And anytime we have a lack of understanding outside of self, we see that that lack of understanding outside of self really causes more trauma than it does good, right? Uh, I have a problem where I self analyze constantly, and I constantly am trying to adjust myself to do less damage and to do better. This is something that I've done since I was really, really young. The problem is when I'm constantly trying to adjust myself to do better for other people, when other people's ideas aren't necessarily better, uh, then I tend to adjust myself to do worse in some spaces. Or I over adjust myself, and the adjustment becomes worse itself. Or I am so caught in the self adjustment need, in this self uh, cons- criticism, that I forget to live and to interact with the other people around me, right? And so I get so caught up, I become distant, lost in my own head. So when we are really caught up in what we experience and what our reality is, and especially when our reality isn't the best informed or is very narrowly informed, then we're really getting this inability to function on a level that is healthy for anybody involved. When we're getting this inability to function on a level that's healthy for anybody involved, this inability to function on a level that's healthy for anybody involved really creates an environment around us where people can't grow and where we're not growing. So while I understand that many people's take on the world around them is very narrow, is very mono educated, and is very mono thought process, I also understand that we're at a pinnacle and a point where people are capable of finding information if they want to. Now, we're also at a pinnacle and a point where that is being used to spoon feed us. So you definitely have to vet your sources and you definitely have to take a look at what you think you're finding information on. Yet there is the information available, and willful ignorance isn't acceptable, especially when willful ignorance damages other people. So when we're looking at the United States from an outside viewpoint, when we're looking at the United States on the world stage, we need to understand certain things like we are literally the highest rate of maternal mortality among the Western world, among the civilized states. On any scale that you want to name the nations that are considered to not be in constant conflict and have constant problems, right? So and I would say that this is on the European scale or on the Western thought scale because of the fact that states that are not deemed to be on that scale are states that have been vastly affected by that scale and traumatized by that scale. So I don't like the Western scale's way of viewing them. On the scale, at 43% in 2018 per capita or per maternity, which means the pregnancy to birth and the birth of the pregnancy, right, and the neonate, the newborn. We have a 43% maternal mortality rate. This was in 2018. I'm sure it has changed. It is not, I have not seen newer numbers, I guess is the best way to put that. And in that, we have that percentage is vastly outnumbered in Black and Indigenous women. So we see that within the medical field, especially within the maternal field or the gynecological field, maybe it's not, what is it, obstetrician field, those who help people give birth, we find that the medical racism within that is really affecting the maternal mortality rate. It is really how we're finding that a large amount of Black and Brown women are dying in pregnancy or in childbirth, either with or without their newborn. We see that these rates are so high because of a lack of understanding of the female body and a lack of understanding that race does not exist, right? There is this thought within Western medicine, within United States medicine, that Black people don't feel pain. And so when you see a woman who is in pain in a medical unit that is primarily racist to believe that Black women don't feel pain, then that medical unit is going to ignore that pain and think that it's just histrionics or think that it's just made up. When you see that Indigenous women by the medical field are generally assumed to have problems with drugs or alcohol, then you see that their issues during pregnancy or their complications during childbirth are ignored as drug seeking. So when you find this racism within obstetrician, blah, 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 childbirth fields, you see that it really affects our ability to be safe within the medical field. Many people aren't aware that pretty much everything within the US in gynecology is built on the pain of Black and Brown women. We should be aware that the father of gynecology within the United States, the man who really invents gynecology, uh, experiments on slave women without anesthesia. He performed hysterectomies and things like that without anesthesia because he believed that Black women didn't feel pain. And this has translated down within the medical field today. We also see that Indigenous women, we know for a fact, or it's public knowledge, were being forced sterilized until 1978. I was born in 1978. I know women who were born in 1978 who were forced sterilized. So it's not that the forced sterilization has stopped, it is that the forced sterilization has shifted in the way of force. Um, and so when we see this, what we're seeing is that this really racist attack on Black and Indigenous women within the medical field is why the maternal mortality rate within the United States is so high. We also see that this lack of understanding of the female body within the United States medical field is really problematic. Most people are unaware of the fact that we test birth control pills on men, birth control pills for women on men. We do not do focal study groups on women for women's issues. We do focal study groups on men for women's issues. And this comes from the medical field really rooting itself in Greek medicine, the allopathic field, really rooting itself in Greek medicine. And when the allopathic field really roots itself in Greek medicine, you see that the Greeks were very anti women. And the Greeks literally thought that women were broken men. And you see that modern medicine or allopathy really carries on this ideal that women are nothing more than broken men. When you see that there's this carry on of this idea that women are nothing more than broken men, you see that this carry on really affects the way women are treated within the medical field. So you take this and you double it down with a healthy dose of racism, and you get a maternal mortality rate that is through the roof. It is no way that our maternal mortality rate should be 43%. There is no way that we should be losing that many women and children in birth. This affects entire communities. It leaves holes in entire communities. And it really carries on when you see that mass incarceration happens in several of the same areas. When you see that mass incarceration happens in several of the same areas, you see that that mass incarceration also happens when people are left with gaping holes in the community to care for each other. So when you're losing women and you're losing children so frequently, many people think maternal mortality is mothers who are in their first pregnancy. Oftentimes, they're mothers who have had 3 or 4 children. So they're leaving behind 3 or 4 children. When you couple that with communities that are over policed and underfunded and really attacked, absolutely sleepy, and really attacked on so many levels, we see that the kindergarten to prison pipeline really takes effect and really comes across very hard for many. Uh, it's really not understood that many police forces are taught from their induction as officers, from their training as officers, to view the spaces that they are working within as being, in literal terms, verbalized as a jungle, like being taught the words, this is a jungle out there, it's not safe, things like that. And they're taught to view everybody who is within that community as a criminal, so that they even view and attack children as criminals. This is where we see videos of 9-year-old girls in the back of a police car getting like punched out by police officers and told to act their age. And they're like, I'm 9, I'm a child. Like, what the fuck do you expect out of me? Not cussing, but that's my words. We see that this really crosses over in things like a welfare call for an 11-year-old autistic boy ends up with the police firing shots and killing that child because he wouldn't leave the street. Is I can't get my 11-year-old out of the street. Would you please come and help me get my 11-year-old out of the street? Sure, we'll help you get him out of the street, right? Uh, this really carries over in the fact that a lot of times people policing communities are not the same people who live in those communities. A lot of times in smaller towns or smaller communities across the United States, you will actually see that, yes, Officer Brown down the street, but you're going to see that in any larger community and any larger cities, you're getting people who are brought in from other areas. And when they're brought in from other areas outside the community that they're policing, they don't have empathy for the community. They don't have understanding of the people within the community. They don't have connection for the people within the community. And this is where you see this incarceration starting at a very young age. And when incarceration starts at a very young age, when you're ripping young children out of their homes and putting them in juvie, or putting them in prison, you are absolutely traumatizing them. You are absolutely causing a disrupt in the chemical process of their brain and their development, and you are actually absolutely causing problems within the way that they interact with society. You're removing them from society, and when people are removed from society, it's harder for them to interact with society. So we see that this cycle tends to continue because it's created, and it is absolutely created with this lack of communal care for communities. And not that the community themselves isn't trying, but that those who are supposed to be protecting and serving, or those who are supposed to be ensuring that communities are thriving, are not ensuring that people are thriving. They're, in fact, ensuring that uh, the structure and the system thrives over the human being. In ensuring that the structure and the system thrives over the human being, we absolutely see that there is this very imprinted idea of racism, this race theory imprinting in the foundation of the United States really creates the number one country in racism. Trevor Noah even talks about how, South Africa came to the US to figure out how to do their racism because the US has the best racism, right? So South Africa came to the US to understand how to function through apartheid and how to create apartheid. We know today that Hitler got pretty much all of his theories and all of his thought processes from the United States. Uh, the concentration camps are very literally direct translations of the reservations here in the United States. We see that this foundation of racism within the government structure, within the system that is created, really goes back to that justification for atrocity. No other country that is currently around today was really created on the blood, or the stolen land of other people, with the blood of a third group, right? So when we look at that, we see that for the United States system to justify its atrocity, racism has to be built in. Racism itself is created in so many ways so that the United States system can justify its atrocity. We've talked in here before about, eugenics really becomes created in 1850s, 1860s as the theory of evolution is created and as the discovery of prior human species is happening. And in this time and in this space, we see that eugenics is really about keeping the white race, as it's deemed, pure. And we see that within that, the theories that are created are very false and very disproven today, right? Have absolutely been disproven today. Uh, we see, though, that those theories not only affect the people of color around them, but they affect the white race. And we see that because we see not only are we seeing the use of eugenics and the use of race to justify the atrocities that are created, uh, but as we're seeing that as we're seeing that transfer from the understanding of biblical morality and biblical history and biblical thought process, we're older than 6,000 years old, we're also seeing that need to bring in the same ideisms, the same the same atrocities that we're getting from the Bible in a different way. So we get the idea that promis- promiscuity is inheritable, or houselessness is inheritable. And we get this idea and start sterilizing women who are promiscuous in our minds, sterilizing women who don't have homes, right? Um, and we see that as this is going through, this is absolutely translating over into the rest of the world, but it is absolutely starting with the ability to maintain reservations and plantations, the slavery system here in the US. Because at the time in the 1850s, pretty much everybody else has started to get rid of their slavery. We were the last holdout. And when we see that we as the America, as the United States was really the last holdout in chattel slavery, do not get me wrong, slavery still exists across the planet, and slavery is different in different places. But as chattel slavery, the last holdout being here in the United States, we absolutely see that the eugenics theory is created to maintain that system. And when that system starts to leave in 1865, which is roughly 15 years after the start of the theory of evolution, after the start of the theory of eugenics, that slips over still. This is how we redline places. This is how we reservation. This is how we justify, bombing entire towns of people. We use this theory that certain genetics are negative genetics, right? Uh, are damaging to the superior Europeans. And in this, we double down on all the structures that were already created based on the racism that was inherent within the idea that those of darker skin are marked by Cain, are marked by God as the children of Ham, Cain's son being Ham. So when we see this, we see that it starts here in the Turtle Islands in that creation. It doubles down when we switch from that biblical thought process that justifies it to a scientific kind of thought process that justifies it. And that they take that scientific thought process of justifying it and continue to cycle it in. Uh, the father of gynecology actually ended up, like, to my I know at least part of his work is after the ending of slavery. He's still using Black women after the ending of slavery and using the genetics and the eugenics theories to operate on Black women. And so you see that this idea of Black women not feeling pain that translates down into that higher maternal mortality rate that we're still seeing here within the United States really comes from, again, that eugenics theory doubling down on the racist thought processes that start when you get to Turtle Island, that start with that need to create a space where Europeans can feel superior. When we see that translating through the end of slavery within the United States, and again, this ends here pretty much after everywhere else. And again, we are talking chattel slavery. We see that the ending of chattel slavery doesn't end slavery even within the US, because we see that the mass incarceration is a result of the 13th Amendment. And the 13th Amendment literally codifies and legalizes slavery. It just delegalizes chattel slavery and instead legalizes the form of slavery that was here before chattel slavery. We talk or hear conversation a lot coming across streams about how indentured servitude is slavery. And indentured servitude is a form of slavery. It is not chattel slavery. There is a huge, you are so welcome. There is a huge difference between indentured servitude or slavery pre-chattel slavery and slavery post-chattel slavery and chattel slavery. And chattel slavery is an inheritance state where you are literal property no more than an animal. Okay. We see that pre-chattel slavery, which is slavery that's either indentured servitude or slavery like the Vikings raiding and taking back slaves, or slavery like we see in Africa at the time, or slavery like we see in Arabia at the time, that this slavery is not an inheritance state. It does not pass on to your children. And this slavery is not a lifetime of slavery, it is a period of time of slavery. You see in all of these spaces that people are able to, slavery is a period of servitude. It is a debt being paid in all other cultures, whether that debt is your life, or that debt is monetary, or that debt is because you took somebody else's life. You see that slavery, pre chattel slavery, is a debt being paid, with the exception of indentured servitude, which is often, wait, no, let me rephrase that. Is a debt being paid? This does translate into indentured servitude. And the way that this translates into indentured servitude, that indentured servitude is oftentimes entered into willingly to, if you were apprenticed to somebody, this is a form of indentured servitude. Being apprenticed is a form of indentured servitude. You're signing yourself over for a period of time. You get no form of money and you have to do everything that's said, and you're pretty much owned by this person for this period of time. It's also a form of punishment, where you see that somebody has stolen a loaf of bread and is signed up for 7 years of indentured servitude and has to work through that 7 years. And oftentimes you see years stacked on by unscrupulous owners of that ticket. But what is owned in this point is the ticket, is the piece of paper, is the indenture, not the human being. We see within chattel or slavery, pre-chattel slavery, in any other space, that what is owned at that time is not the being themselves, but the period of time, whether or not they're paying off being captured in a raid, whether or not they're paying off their father's fines, whether or not it is to, being enslaved so that you can move communities or grow better within a community, learn a trade within a community, whether or not, whatever method it comes about pre-chattel slavery, it is something that is not translated down to your children, and it is not translated longer than your life. There are some exceptions to this thought process. We would see that the Judaic understanding of their period of slavery in Egypt translates down to generational, right? So that is going to be a form of chattel slavery. It is the only documented form or knowledgeable form of chattel slavery outside of the chattel slavery period that comes after 1492, that starts in the 1600s. It's the only documentation of chattel slavery that I understand or know of prior to this. When we're looking at that, we see that the shift that the 13th Amendment makes is from chattel slavery back into indentured servitude. The 13th Amendment very specifically says nobody should be owned by another unless they performed a crime. And this is where we get mass incarceration. Mass incarceration comes from having people who own these prisons, and so they make money off of the number of the people who are incarcerated. Frequently, they also make money off of forcing them to do labor. If there is payment for that labor, that payment is small and pretty much non-existent. You're talking like 10 cents an hour kind of payment, right? When you're seeing this, what you're seeing is a new form of slavery. It is, well, new isn't correct. You're seeing a return to an older form of slavery. What you're seeing is still a method of slavery. And this method of slavery within the United States really translates down to the more people that we can keep incarcerated, the more owned bodies we have, right? Incarceration often removes any rights that somebody has. If somebody is a felon, they can't own a gun, they can't vote, things like that. So we see that this incarceration really comes from a control of community, really comes from being trained to see the negative in all things, and really comes from a need of exploitation, a need to be able to exploit as much as possible. We see that early on, the 13th Amendment and incarceration really is a direct translation back into slavery. You see that people are incarcerated and then they are put to work on plantations. They are put to work in cotton farms. Uh, and we see that this translation directly into slavery doesn't really change as we go further out fully. What changes about it is you see that children younger and younger are entering into it. And what changes about it is that you see that not a lot of the work is done outside of four walls, right? And that's only because of their need to prevent escape. We do see that there are still plenty of places that it is. There is a famous sheriff in some county in like Arizona or something like that who makes everybody wear pink and puts them in camps and forces them to do hard labor. Um, People will tell you that the incarceration population is 49% white, and then they'll break down the numbers of all the people of color within that incarceration to try and make it look like it's more white people than anybody else. But even if it's 49% white, that's still 51% not white, right? That is still over half of the incarceration population being non-white. And I would still want to look at those numbers because I'm pretty sure that 49% is pretty high for white people in prison. We see that this translation within that racist thought process, though, is even incarcerating white people, right? Because what you're seeing is that this idea that you're so if we believe that we're trying to uphold and uplift the Europeans, then anything that is negative to Europeans can be eradicated, right? So this is where we see talking about sterilizing people within the United States. We saw it with the case of Carrie Bell. Her mother had children by more than one man and was houseless. And so when Carrie Bell at 16 got pregnant, and they didn't know who the father was, they forced sterilized Carrie, and they ended up forced sterilizing the child of that birth, right? Because they decided that this was something inheritant, the having children by multiple men and not having a home. We see that this happens when we see that idea of putting people who have mental problems in institutions or sterilizing people who have mental problems. So we see that this racism and the way that it hurts people is not just hurting people of color, right? It is actually also spinning back to reflect on and cause trauma to people who are not as melanated. And this is because if you're trying to keep something pure in your very narrow idea of what purity is, then you're eradicating everything that doesn't contribute to your very narrow idea of what purity is, right? Uh, so we see that when we're looking at white men being incarcerated or white people being incarcerated, what we're looking at is that blowback of the racism and this decision that this is not people who you want to help contribute to your genetics. You see that again, this translated over into Hitler's theories and the way that Hitler actually worked the Holocaust. And he actually works the Holocaust based on the Holocaust that's already happened in the Americas because the Holocaust had already happened. And using those theories and those ideas, I wouldn't even say he doubles down because let's be real, the only thing he does is streamlines it. They were already doing it in so many horrific ways, right? The only thing he does is streamlines it. And we see that later on that when South Africa starts apartheid, that this is why they come to the United States, because the racism within the United States is so ingrained in the culture and is the best racism in the world, right? It is the best racist system in the world. We see, though, that this really goes back to that Western thought ideology starting. We've talked before in here about the fact that when Western thought starts, we see this need to other. Western thought is that foundation of civilization, which I do not like using that word because very much so civilization should be civil and civilized, and nothing about civilization as civil or civilized. When we see the start of this translation, that Land can be owned. That the world around you is not its own sense of self, does not have autonomy, that the biome around you does not have autonomy. And we see this start of property ownership. And then we see the ability to disconnect the autonomy from the land, translate over to disconnecting the autonomy from the animals, translates over to disconnecting the autonomy from different human beings based on social structure. When we see that this starts, we see this starting in, we call it Western. It's literally like the Levant area. Uh, now, okay, so it's probably a little bit wider than the Levant area. Mesopotamia. These are all in, I believe, the Near East, or maybe it's the Middle East. I'm so bad with geography. But when we see these start, what we're seeing is at the top of the Arabian Peninsula, from one side of it over to the other side, and underneath the Caucasus Mountains, right? So when we see this starting, what we're seeing is the start of these cities that cause climate destruction initially. First cities cause climate destruction. The first cities built on Western agriculture cause climate destruction. Uh, and we see that there is this need to maintain power. Now, this is where we really start to see narcissism within humanity, and we really start to breed narcissism into humanity. Narcissism, psychopathy, and megalomania, the dark triad. We see within our first documented histories of the first kings that we have, the first rulers that we have, that they're all God kings. And almost all of these God kings really are God kings because as children, they were abandoned by a deity parent, found by a very poor person, and raised in a very poor environment, raised with very little. So they have that traumatic disconnect of being abandoned by their parent. They've created a god or a deity out of their parent. And then they have the traumatic childhood of being raised in dearth, being raised without. This often creates narcissism. We see even today when people have the gene for narcissism, if they do not have the trauma, they do not tend to become narcissistic. We see that the early kings, the early rulers really all share these very similar stories. And in really sharing all of these similar stories, we're seeing that this share of these similar stories really is this signifier within history of that narcissism or that megalomania or that psychopathy, right? Because when we look at those dark triad problems, what we're looking at is people who have those traumatic childhoods, often with a lack of anything in them, often with a lack of fundamental needs being met, and almost always with the abandonment of one parent or the other, right? If not abandonment, then extremely traumatic abuse from one parent or the other. And so this is like textbook foundation story to have these psychopathies. And then you see this translate out into the way that they king. And you see this translate out in the way that they king because you see early on that othering starts. Othering is the barbarians in the hills are going to take your grain, so you need to give me your grain instead so that I can pay my army so that they'll protect you from the barbarians in the hills. And if you're lucky, I'll leave you with enough to feed yourself. This again is a method of control that narcissism uses already, and that is really doubled down in the way that we see power structures work from the very beginning of Western thought. When we see stratification in a Western style, that stratification in a Western style really doubles down on control of the masses through manipulation and propaganda. And the best way to control people is to get them to fear something and protect them from what they fear. So if they can get you to fear the barbarians in the hill, that other nation, that religion, that other skin tone, the immigrants, the houseless, if they can get you to fear something else, then you're not fearing what's trying to kill you. You don't see the knife stabbing you in the back. You don't see the control that's eating away at your survivability rate. So we see that this really roots in the very early, very first parts of Western thought. And this really early thought root and this very early foundation in Western thought, which really starts roughly 10,000 years ago, really carries over. And this is where we get racism. This is where we get the racist structure. And as we maintain that racist structure, we're maintaining that racist structure through othering. In that maintenance of that othering structure that has such a foundation of racism within it, um, we see that this gives the US this unique structure in the way that it's killing itself, right? Um, this unique lateral violence that you don't see in a lot of other structures. Um, and in this way of othering, we see this teaching of narcissism, megalomania, psychopathy as being a positive. So when we're looking at really good examples today is the idea that voting to take care of other people is harming you, right? We That's socialism, that's communism. We're a capitalistic nation, which literally root says that's taking care of the social structure, that's taking care of the community. We instead found ourselves on what we can exploit. Capitalism is all about exploiting. Communism is all about community. Socialism is all about social structure. Nobody who's written about socialism or communism got it right because they're all looking at it through a capitalistic lens. And everybody who's practiced socialism or capitalism in the modern world is practicing it through a capitalistic lens. So it's practicing through an exploitation lens, and that practicing through an exploitation lens changes it from actual communism or actual socialism. But when we see this, what we're seeing is this teaching you that having compassion or empathy for community or social structure is a negative. You should be chasing that dollar instead, right? Which keeps that foundation, that narcissistic thought process that those who can lack compassion and empathy are the superior part of us in place. When we look at those who rule, because let's be honest, that's what they do. When we look at those who are in control, because again, let's be honest, that's what they're doing. What we're seeing is this distinct lack of empathy and compassion. And we're also seeing that people draw to like minds. And people have a tendency, especially if they're lacking in compassion, empathy, to look for other people who are lacking in compassion and empathy. We'll often see this phrase as alpha, right? That alpha man out there. We only like alpha men. We don't take a beta. And, like women can't ever be alpha. And, that kind of thought process that tells you that only those who are aggressive and lack compassion and empathy are the pinnacle of the human race. And so everybody else is fodder. Everybody else is to be consumed, exploited. Sometimes we see this translate in very obvious manners. You see people like Andrew Tate out there talking about how, it's great to be a white male, right? Like I don't have to take care of nobody else. I don't have to this, that, blah, 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 blah. Um, it should be understood that things like this hurt everybody, not just the people that those groups are attacking. They actually hurt those groups as well. That distinct lack of compassion and empathy is actually extremely problematic. Well, that person's just stupid, I have to say. The person in Florida who decided to get rid of everybody who's doing the work. Hard, right? Like, why are you going to send everybody home who's doing the fucking work? Now you can't get nothing done. Duh, we told you. Nobody wants to go out and do the work for your jack shit wages anyways. Anybody who's here in America or who came to the United States or who's born in the United States has this idea that we deserve more anyways. Like, I mean, that's the whole foundation of the propaganda that it's American dream. You're going to make more money, right? So nobody's going to go out there and work for less money. And let's be real, there ain't nobody in the United States that does the work that Mexicans do. People from Mexico, people from actually several different South American countries, people who come in from south of the American border or the United States border are the hardest working, cheeriest fucking people you will ever meet. Anytime you're working with people who have come from south of the United States border, you're working with people who show up 15 minutes early, work harder than anybody else on on that lot, do it for less money, and do it with a grin on their face, probably cranking some music and singing and dancing with you. Every interaction, every time, every space. I have worked with people who originate from south of the United States border for the vast majority of my life. I've always been in communities where there are a lot of people who come from south of that border. And I mean, I'm in the Pacific Northwest, been in the military. Like, there's a lot of people coming from that south of that border space. And every single time, and every single one, you are looking at the hardest working workers out there, and they're going to do it for less money. So, why you think that you're going to remove that and somebody's going to wipe your ass for you still? You know, so he's just an idiot, probably a narcissist as well, but just an idiot as well. Um, but that structure is really there, right? And that he's using that structure, he's using that thought process, he's using that understanding to really double down on that, to really kind of fuck everybody over, right? And really, there's been a lack of consequences for those on top for a long time, right? The consequences are always felt for by those below. Uh, the only way to make it change really is to make it felt by those on top. And hopefully things like what he's done will make it felt by things by people on top. That's my only hope as I go along is, maybe we'll make them feel it. And only when they feel it are they really going to get it through their head. But we absolutely see that thought process, that taking care of each other, that thought process that exploitation is not okay, that thought process that I am worthy just because I am here is really lacking in that narcissistic thought process. We see that within Western culture, this has really been taught as a biblical thing. And so it's really been taught as loving behavior. We see that control is taught as loving behavior. We see that manipulation and propaganda is taught as loving behavior. So we see that we parent frequently in a narcissistic parenting style. We see that we love and we commune with each other frequently in a narcissistic way. And we see that because we see very literally narcissistic things taught as loving behavior, as a loving God. I am using the New Oxford Annotated Bible, 5th edition, fully revised and expanded. It has the Apocrypha within it as well. When I go to Exodus and look at Exodus, I had to do this for a class on Middle Eastern archaeology, actually, or Near Eastern archaeology. When you read Exodus, from the very first chapter and verse, you start to see Yahweh or God coming across as a very negative person. And I'm specifying Yahweh in this because this is that specific God. I'm not going to use that name any other. I just want to specify that this is the God that you know, or that this is the God that we are speaking of. When we're looking at this in Exodus, we are seeing that, and he even says to Moses, the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders that I have put in your power, but I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. And so he says, go to the Lord and go to Pharaoh and tell Pharaoh that you're going to, this one's a little bit further back because this is firstborn sons. You see that from the very beginning, sorry, I went too many pages. Because this is the one that's actually talking about okay, we'll go with that one. Starting in the 4th chapter, you see him stating that to Moses. And what he's stating is, let my son go so that he may worship me, but you refuse to let him go, and now I will kill your firstborn son. I know that we've gone through seven plagues before we get there, and there's a whole bunch of stuff after this. But in each and every one of these things, you see that after Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, Pharaoh, I would like to go and leave with my people so that we can pray. And every time Pharaoh goes, okay, let me think about it. I think I can do that. Let me think about that. I think I can do that. And every time you see that God then goes to Pharaoh and hardens Pharaoh's heart. I will multiply my signs and wonders in the land. Again and again throughout here, you see that the plagues come across, and each time you see, here's chapter 9, verse 7. Pharaoh inquired and found that not one of the livestock of the Israelites was dead. But the Lord came to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened. 9:12. But the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he would not listen to them, just as the Lord had spoken to Moses. So every time Moses is saying, here's chapter 10, first verse. When the Lord said, go to Pharaoh, Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his officials. So Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh. This says the Lord. And Pharaoh goes, you know what? I'll let you guys leave. It's going to be easier for me if you guys leave. And then God comes in. The Lord hardens Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let the Israelites go. You find that throughout this same cycle happens. This same cycle of go ask God for this, or go ask Pharaoh for this. Moses goes and asks Pharaoh. Pharaoh says, let me think about it. I think that that's okay. Because initially all Moses is asking is to go outside of town and pray. Like, he's not asking to leave as a people. So he goes and he says, hey, Pharaoh, I'd like to do this. And Pharaoh goes, okay, we'll let you do that. And then God comes and says, don't do that. And then Moses comes back and Pharaoh goes, no, I can't. So every time Pharaoh is doing what God has told Moses to do, or what God has told Pharaoh to do, every time Pharaoh is obeying God. In the end, you see that Pharaoh literally says to Moses, I am doing this so you will sing my praises for all eternity. You will laud me for all eternity. And this is the reason that Moses does, or that God does this with Moses. So God visits 7 plagues upon Egypt, literally so the Israelites will laud his praises for eternity. When we see this, we see it translates down through pretty much every interaction of God and human in the Bible. When we see this translation down, we see it translate down when he impregnates a 13-year-old girl and leaves her in a community that will stone her to death for that. And then after abandoning them for 33 years, decides to kill the child that he created in a torturous manner, all to free everybody of sin. So you say it's a sin, you tell them they can do it, because that's what free will is, and then you choose to punish somebody to free them of that sin. It's very narcissistic parenting, very narcissistic behavior. Do you kill one child to keep the other 5 from doing things that you told them to do? Right? You see this translate down into Job, where he is literally testing him. And narcissism is testing. Testing is narcissism. That kind of behavior is very narcissistic. So we see that we are taught that this is a loving deity, and that if we want to be loving, we should be Christ-like or God-like. Now, we're not taught how Christ actually behaved, because Christ's actual behavior is pretty loving. We're taught something completely different. But we are taught that this behavior, this narcissistic behavior, is loving parenting. And when we're taught that this narcissistic behavior is loving parenting, what we're taught is to parent narcissistically. So narcissistic parenting creates trauma. So we're creating trauma. When we're doing that, and we have spent 10,000 years breeding with this top level of society that so obviously has narcissism within it, right? That is so obviously part of that dark triad with a lack of compassion and a lack of empathy for others. We see that we have gone from narcissism just being a random occasional mutation to having bred it in our society to the point that at this point it's like 15% of humanity is part of the dark triad. At 8 billion people on this planet, 15% of them are part of the dark triad. And this is because if the only way that you can feed your children is to marry up in the rank structure, to marry somebody on this higher level, and this higher level is creating jobs for all of its children and grandchildren and, all of that sort of stuff, and keeping them on the level right below it, then you're marrying into this level. So the children of this level are surviving more, passing down their genetics more. And that pass down of that genetics multiplies the presence of those disease processes, the presence of that disorder within us. And we see that this pass down and this translation with this doubling down of teaching that parenting style or teaching that behavioral style as a positive really translates into a rise within our society of narcissism, megalomania, and psychopathy. This also translates into grape culture. This is very much that othering translating to within your society between the genders. And when you see that the Greeks start this, when they start othering women and start making women out to be broken men, which again traces back to that maternal mortality rate as well, we see that this idea that you can possess a woman starts to grow. This idea that somebody who possesses a womb is therefore owned by others and must be owned and controlled by others starts to grow. In this idea that we must be owned and controlled by others if we possess a womb, we get this idea that you have the right to somebody with a womb. You have the right to possess somebody with a womb. If you're doing all the right things, if you're a good man, you get a womb, right? Doesn't matter, it's in another body. You're a good man, you get a womb. Here's your womb. And within the US specifically, and within countries that have really doubled down on their biblical thought process, like in the US, marital rape didn't become outlawed until 1990s, right? I think it was 1998 to be specific. Right? So we see that there is this thought process that if you're a good man, you get to own a womb. And this thought process really doubles down on grape culture within our society, especially when we see this idea that if you can get one that has never been touched by another person, or if you can get one that's young enough to mold, or if you can get one that, like, what's the best womb you can get kind of stuff. It really dehumanizes those that bear wombs. It also really turns people into possessions. And in that turning people into possessions, we see that there's this lack of autonomy, right? So this is where we have seen othering translate down completely through and translate over through narcissism, through God into racism, and through that into a racist structure. When we look at that, we can also see that Western thought in its initial start first creates ownership of property as land loses autonomy. And when pieces of the planet lose autonomy, and that's able to translate into pieces, animals lose autonomy, humans lose autonomy. That first start, we see that Angazala is the oldest city based on agriculture that we have, based on Western agriculture. It's 9,000 years old, and it took 300 years to destroy the area it was in. It was on a fertile fertile riverbed in a fertile valley. And in 300 years, it had destroyed that entire valley. This is because Western agriculture comes in and strips everything, strips all the nutrients, takes everything out of the biome, and doesn't replace any of it. And it puts a monoculture in. That monoculture, therefore, gets no nutrients. That monoculture isn't thriving because it doesn't have the things that it needs to thrive around it. In a biome, all of the different elements of the biome nutrient all of each other, right? That's that circle of life kind of thought process, right? That's the predator versus prey. There is this nutrition that you can find within your biome. You can find all the nutrition you need. It doesn't matter what your species is within the biome. If you remove that biome, the plants, which are species that you put in to that biome, is no longer capable of getting the nutrients because you've removed them. So this destroys climate. We see that this translates down into the modern US. And this translates down into the modern US when we see that when Europeans document landing on Turtle Island in North America, they document north to south, east to west as a tended garden. When Spanish get to California, they document California as being a tended garden. In the 1800s, 1700s, early 1900s, all of that tended garden was ripped out. Colonialists came in, took the prairies, which are a beautiful biome with 2-3 feet deep roots, ripped it all out and replaced it with monoculture or not monoculture, mono agriculture. Replaced it with a single plant, right? Or 2 or 3 plants, ripping out the entire biome, ripping out all the nutrients. And when they then drained the land of whatever nutrients had been stored within the land over millions of years of the biome that had existed, they left, and they left a dust bowl. There are literal songs from like the 20s and 30s and 40s. They're like, think you're going to a sugar bowl, but you're going to a dust bowl. And it's because of the fact that you see that during the Great Depression, a part of that depression was the fact that that entire swath that had been much of a grain box, bread box, was no longer able to produce because they had robbed the land of all the nutrients because they had destroyed the biome and not, replaced it with anything healthy. Not that you can really replace it with anything healthy. It's better to not destroy biomes. So we see that not only does it cause that climate destruction, but mono agriculture, mono food sources cause things like diabetes and food deserts. When we see that everything that you're eating is made from 2 or 3 different plant matters, you're not getting a variety of vitamins, you're not getting a variety of minerals, you're not getting a variety of anything. We also see that a lot of these things that are being created from those mono agricultural fields are not providing, like, all the nutrients are taken out of them in the processing. So if you go into your kitchen, you'll find a dozen different things made from corn and a dozen different things made from flour. And some of these things, in the way that they're made, remove really all of the nutrients that you would find in the corn or the flour. Even white rice is really a removal of all the nutrients that you find in rice, right? Oh, I believe that. Um, in that, we absolutely see that translates into a high presence of diabetes. We also see that this inability to create a diverse food environment also translates into food deserts. There are many spaces where you have to drive 2 or 3 hours to buy food, where you might have a local grocery store if you're in a city, but it doesn't sell vegetables or it doesn't sell fruits. All it sells is heavily processed things. These food deserts are created with this Western agricultural need to confine our agriculture into specific spaces and then transport it after we've done a whole bunch of shit to it, right? And so this creates the inability to walk out your back door and get food. This creates an inability to have a diverse diet. And these things really lead to an increase in problematic health within all of us, right? Um, and we can see that all of this stuff really traces back to that initial thought process that by doing this, I can control everybody, I can hoard, right? That initial Western thought process is very much about what I can exploit from others. and it uses othering that goes through several different phases and through racism. And we still have all of these phases actually present. We still have the idea of the barbarians in the hills. We still have the idea of that other nation is not as good as our nation. We still have that idea of that other religion is not as good as our other religion or as our religion. We absolutely still have racism so ingrained within our system that we fail to recognize it half the time. We absolutely still have a misogyny so ingrained within our system that we fail to recognize it sometimes. We absolutely still have this idea that it is our right to be locusts and control the planet ingrained into our system to the point that we are absolutely destroying the planet around us and each other as we go. And through this all, we see that telling you that the problem is your neighbor keeps people in charge of you, keeps people in control of you. As long as you allow the othering, as long as you participate in the othering, as long as you are working within that othering system, as long as it's somebody else that's the problem and not the government that is controlling you, that is the problem, we maintain the government in control. We maintain the problem, and it becomes this cycle that's self defeating. I'm going to open for questions for a couple, and then I'm probably going to take off. I've got some other stuff that I'm working on, and I want to make sure I can get some of that done today. And I had some appointments this morning. Prison labor is absolutely used everywhere. Have you seen all the lawsuits coming through, or the arrests coming through, or the fines coming through for violating the youth labor laws that are currently happening? Like, there's a lot of weird stuff going. Pretty good. I've only got a few more pages to do. And really, I've only got a couple more pages of drawing the actual piece coming through. And then it's going to go to the coloring in of it. And then I'll do the water portion of it so it colors out. And then when I do the water portion of it so it colors out, probably do that over a couple of pages and then it'll be done. I'm really excited. I think that it's really coming along beautifully. I'm really liking the way that it feels and the way that it looks. A part of me is like, oh my God, I'm not sure. It's not that great. It's not that good. But then a part of me is remembering that it's not supposed to be. It doesn't need to be. It's not about it being, I'm a great artist. It's about just illustrating it. That's really difficult for me. And so I'm trying to remember that as I do it. And I think that this looks like an octopus down here, and I'm not really that happy with how this looks. I mean, just different things. I'm like, but you get to a level where you can't fix it because it's really done in something that's not really fixable, right? And so it'll work in its end, right? Thank you. What is today? Today is Thursday or Wednesday. No, it's Thursday, right? So probably be on in the morning tomorrow. And then probably not for the weekend. Probably not even Sunday because I have people coming in from out of town, family coming in from out of town. So I don't think I'll be here Sunday. Thursday the 1st. Sims has a couple of new pack drops that I want to make sure I can get to play today. So I'm going to go ahead and take off. Yeah, I'll be around tomorrow. I'll try and do a notice or an event so that people can see it coming in so they know that it's there.